Hi, my name's Kat,
And my name is Garth.
and Ben has asked us to talk about what we've been doing for the past few years. So we have been working in different countries. First, we worked in Vietnam for about a year, and now we are living in Mexico, and we've been here for about a year, and we're English teachers. So we both had lived in Australia. First, I lived there for 6 years, but I'm originally from California in the USA.
And I've lived there most of my life. My family is Australian, but I grew up in Papua New Guinea and moved there when I was 12.
Yeah. So Ben's asked us some questions to answer. So I'll read the first one. Can you describe your initial experiences of encountering cultural differences in places like Vietnam and Mexico? Could you talk a little bit about the kinds of everyday issues you might have had navigating around for everyday things like shopping, laundry, and getting things like housing, work, and travel organized? Basically, how have we dealt with that?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing you notice when you're in a new country and you're living in a new country is that all of the things that you take for granted are usually turned on their head. Things that are cheap and widely available in your home country are often not in the new country you're living in. And conversely, some things that were fabulously exotic and not that available in your home country can sometimes be really cheap and widely available. At the moment, for example, corn tortillas and good quality limes, really cheap.
And avocados. Yeah, and mezcal as well.
Yeah, for example. But it's also, I think, day-to-day living is the thing that really challenges you when you first move to another country, because simple interactions, you really have to think about. Organizing things like the laundry or the shopping is something that requires a lot more involvement. And at every possible stage of interaction, you're thinking about what you have to do, what the best way to respond is, what's polite, what is maybe impolite. When you're in your home country, you take a lot of this for granted, and you can sort of breeze through these everyday activities.
It's all about routines. I mean, in Australia there's a routine, in the USA there's a routine, and I think in Australia I had to get used to it. But then when you go to a different country where English isn't the first language, you're dealing with a language barrier, as well as just a completely different way of doing these basic tasks. Here, when you want to have your laundry done, there's no laundromat. You have to take the laundry to a place, and then they weigh it, and then they take it from you, and you pick it up the next day, folded and pressed, which is nice. But the first time you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting that.
And it's not cheap.
No, I mean,
you can't do that forever.
No, yeah. Then you find someone with a laundry machine so you can use it. Yeah, and like what you were saying, Garth, it's just everyday normal things. And at first, it just takes so much energy to find out where to get your vegetables, what stores are good for coffee, which cafes are good for coffee when you need one. So I mean, when you get to a new place, you just have a list of basics that you need to meet, and then after that, you can start enjoying the other aspects. When we were in Vietnam, I organized the housing, and that took a lot of research. You have to go on forums to ask questions. Is this something that's done under the table with on a website search engine like Gumtree, or do you have to do it in a more formal way? And so we depended a lot on the advice of other people.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important point. This, I think, would be true for many people who are living in new countries. The support of people who already live there, who either share your experience or are friendly and willing to help you and make space for you and allow you to be a foreigner and allow you to get things wrong,
be awkward,
and then eventually get over it. It's that sort of generosity and that willingness to let you learn and make mistakes. That's really essential, I think, for any recent migrant to a country.
And even as visitors too.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Next question.
Did you have any particular experiences of culture shock? If so, what were they and how did you handle them?
Okay, so culture shock, we sort of talked about this. It's like, it's not really a shock. You know, it seems like everything can be a shock when you're in a new country. But, you know, it's just all of a sudden everything you know is quite different. And so if you go in with like no expectations, then you kind of can slowly build up what your world is. And then after some time you get confident, and then, you know, eventually there's something else that surprises you. So it kind of goes in a wave pattern, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to take your point about expectations, I think having had the experience when I was 12 of moving from one country to another country and experiencing the full blast of disruption to your life and just having to relearn everything. I did that a couple of times when I was growing up, moved to different countries with my family. And so I think in this case, I was a little prepared for weirdness and shocks and things to be different in places like Vietnam and Mexico, because I didn't know those countries. They were going to be completely new to me. So I went in thinking, okay, you know nothing, everything's going to be weird and difficult, let's see what happens. Where I didn't do that was the United States when we were visiting your family for a few months. And I think I'd assumed that it would be really similar to Australia. You know, we've all seen American films, we watch a lot of American television, all of us in our lives.
You know me.
I know you, you're American. So I just assumed it would be, you know, beyond a few language differences, more or less the same. And it really, really wasn't. There were so many things where I was just confronted with how alien I was in that environment.
Because you were relaxed.
I was relaxed, and I think this was the thing. I had far more assumptions in the United States. Politeness is completely different in the USA compared to Australia. Little things like when you're having dinner with somebody, there's an expectation, I learned, in the United States that within the first couple of minutes of eating that somebody in the group, one of the guests, will praise the host for their dinner. It's not like in Australia where you might say, thanks for having us round or thanks for dinner. Within 5 minutes, somebody has to say, oh, you know, Carol, this casserole is delicious. And everybody goes, yes, it's wonderful.
It's true.
And, you know, I was kind of confronted by all of these little experiences every day, and I wouldn't be doing these things. And you would have to be sort of nudging me going, you need to say thank you for this, or you know, we ought to bring this around to the house. And I guess also, just to finish the point, I think in the USA there's an expectation that English language speakers from other Western countries would share these habits already, and we don't. Where in Mexico and Vietnam, we're foreigners, and everybody expects you to get things wrong and to not understand it.
We have more leeway.
Or a longer grace period in which to catch up. And I think like now, for example,
they expect us to know things.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been a year.
Yeah.
I think also it's interesting because there is a difference between arriving as a traveler, and I think we'll talk about this later, but a traveler, tourist, and then someone who's more integrated. And because you were there with me and in my family,
right,
you were seeing a layer of the USA that most tourists don't get to see.
Right, and I had been to the USA as a tourist, and of course was spared all of this. You know, you skim across the surface.
But when you're in the guts of it, then you have to do all these extra things.
Then you're being assessed by the aunts and the grandmothers, and yeah.
So it's different. I was going to say one thing that I find really interesting about, or I found interesting, was just like public transport in different countries. In Vietnam, you get on the bus, same here. You get on the bus and you just gotta go in a line. There's someone that's like lining you up in the bus where you have to all be in a straight line so that it can be packed as much as possible. And the conductor's kind of shuffling people and making sure you're not taking up too much space. And it barely stops for like a second. And no safety.
You're lost.
You're kind of like this. And same with Mexico as well.
Yeah, for sure.
That sort of stuff is confronting, and then you get used to it.
Yeah.
I think little things like everyday stuff like this can be really shocking and funny. So the next question. So when we were finally settled in places like Vietnam and Mexico, did we notice our way of relating to our environment writ large or changing or evolving? And if so, to what extent do you feel that entering one unknown environment and coming to terms with it prepared us for the next one?
This sort of relates a little bit to what I was saying before about the way I grew up, because with my family, we lived in Papua New Guinea, we lived in Australia, we lived in the Netherlands. So I had this experience a few times growing up, but I don't think you ever really get used to the idea of being in a new place. You are maybe more prepared for the experience of going through this adjustment period. So you're a little more mentally prepared, but you do still get caught off guard. And I think the big thing that I have kept relearning is that you can't know what your assumptions truly are until you're confronted by something that you didn't expect, because they are the real assumptions. The ones that you can notice and think, well, I assume this before I'm going in. It's not really the core deep values or ways or perspectives that you might have on the world that you don't question. Those things are confronted at some point usually, and that's when you realize that you've just simply overlooked something, and you had no idea that other people in the world could see this differently or do it differently.
I was going to say, there's also just a skill set of traveling that you kind of get used to, either if you're traveling by yourself or with a partner. But we learn, like, when you get to a new country and you haven't eaten, don't talk to each other until you eat and feel better. There's just like you get somewhere and you say, okay, we've got to first find Wi-Fi, and then we have to find how to get a SIM card for our phones. And hopefully you will have booked accommodation already, so you find your hostel. And then if you're going to stay a while, you start researching as to where you can go to get your house. So there's like a pattern, and once you've done it once, you kind of know what you need to do in what order.
But that's the pattern, say, of a tourist traveling from country to country. But that's a bit different from the pattern of having to adjust to living. When you, for example, the reason why we live in Mexico now and not in Vietnam is because we were concerned about the level of pollution in Hanoi, and you also wanted to be closer to your family in California, your friends. So we moved, and coming into Mexico, it wasn't quite the same thing as when you're having this, adventure holiday time, exploring and feeling free. When you're coming in and you know you're going to be working and living, and you're not setting yourself up for holiday adventures, you still have this kind of checklist, but it's definitely different.
Smaller, yeah, it's
very
different.
small.
But you still, once you get to your, like, we didn't have a house when we got here. We had an interview.
Right.
We knew where the school was, and we had an Airbnb booked. But when you get there, you still need your Wi-Fi, and you still need to just say, where am I? And then go to the next step, and then that just gets bigger and bigger, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think there are skills that you learn along the way that are kind of transferable.
Sure, but I think to answer the question, the idea is really that, one of the question about entering unknown environments and how that prepares you for the next. I think the thing I like about being in a new country is that you do feel like a child again. I don't know if you'd agree with this, but everything is new. For example, in the United States, this is one of the assumptions that I had made I thought that having a shower would be easy.
Right.
And in the United States, they have these weird handles and secret buttons and things you pull, or there's something you've got to twist.
Yeah.
It's not what you would experience in Australia. And I would genuinely get lost. I felt demented standing in these showers. Cat, come and help me turn this. How do I turn this on?
On the other hand, it's similar to like when you go to the supermarket in the USA, there are 50 different types of ice cream. And there's also like 50 different types of faucet handles you can use. So they're all different.
They are different.
Every house has a different mechanism.
But I mean,
options.
the point being that whether it's public transport or whether it's trying to find food in a supermarket or whether it's, do you remember trying to find a can opener in Hanoi?
Yeah, it was hard.
Impossible. Because there's another assumption. People are not eating canned food as much. This is a weird luxury item that foreigners look for. So the thing I like about it is suddenly you're paying attention to everything. And it is like being a child again because
you're learning.
You're learning every single day, and that is thrilling. And I think being more aware of that as you go into another country definitely prepares you, but you can't know the things that you're going to
you just know, you need at least a week or 2 or 3
or a month
before you start working or, going to school. So you can just like have that mental space to deal with things and then sleep, because it's stressful. It is stressful. Can you read the next one?
Yeah, of course. Okay. How do you feel that working in a country differs from a trip where you play the role of a tourist? To what extent does being able to interact with locals in a teaching and learning context give added depth and meaning to your intercultural experience?
This is something we talk about a lot because we see ourselves as residents here and we have a residency card.
We pay tax.
So we're here. And I think that mental that paradigm, that shift from tourist, which we have done quite a bit of as well, into resident makes a huge difference. It helps your relationships with your colleagues. And I think it also, the students take us more seriously because they know that we care about their home, and they help us to integrate as well. In our classes, we're able to talk about anything, and so they share a lot of their experiences with us and teach us things about, in this case, Mexican culture. We share meals together at lunchtime. So we're learning and we're socializing, and then outside of class, we have coffee, chatting clubs. All of our students are adults, so that means that, it's appropriate to have friendships with our students. And it's really wonderful. And on the other hand, you as a tourist, you're kind of fleeting in and out of a place. And then we've met a lot of people who are also residents who don't integrate so much.
No, it's true.
And that's something we try to do.
Well, I think a lot depends on the attitude you have when you enter into a country. If you're entering into a country with the intention of spending an extended period of time there, either permanently or at least for a longer period of time, you're much more likely to invest time in learning the language, for example, which we've been doing here. You're also going to invest time in getting to understand and integrate with the just with the way of doing things here, for example, in Cuernavaca. So within a country, there are a set of norms that everybody kind of gets, and as a foreigner, you don't get.
It takes a while to get it.
It does take a long time, and I don't know if, as a foreigner, you ever get it 100%. You might, if you've lived in a country for most of your life, get 90% of it, but there are just so many things that you take for granted that you can't know about until you've stumbled over it or you've made an ass of yourself and done something inappropriate.
Well, also language. I mean, until you master the language, you're missing a lot of these double meanings in speak, or different ways of joking with each other, or
Or
I
even
think
when
we're
you,
missing a lot still.
oh, definitely, definitely, we've got so much more to learn, no question. But it is frustrating when you have to filter your expression to this relatively narrow range of expression and kind of offer this.
And I also think that even though we do feel like we're learning a lot and integrating a lot, as we talked about before, we're foreigners. We look like foreigners,
Yeah.
and we're treated like foreigners still. Just whether in a good, I mean, people are very friendly and everything like that, but they do see us as people who are foreigners.
Yeah.
And they help us along.
I feel like it's sort of like bit by bit you're allowed to integrate more. Allowed to is an interesting choice of words. It's not that people are unfriendly, but it's more that people assume either one, that you're not going to be here forever, or two, that you couldn't possibly understand something.
Yeah.
So it's, for example, I remember the delight. Vietnam's a classic example of this.
Yeah, that was
The first time that we had conversation with our friends and we commented about having caught a bus somewhere and gone to a shop or something. Wow, you managed to do that all by yourself, literally treating us like kind of children. But it's because we
are speaking like children.
Yeah, exactly. When you're trying to speak a foreign language and you're still learning, obviously you do sound childlike at the beginning. But also I think there's this sense that as a foreigner, there's so much you don't understand. Kind-hearted people from the country that you're living in will try and make things easier for you.
Yeah.
But the assumption is, of course, that you are somehow
incapable.
And that's why I think maybe it just takes a little bit of time for these things to open up and for you to integrate.
Yeah, I mean, even still in Mexico, our friends are saying, text me when you get home, which is nice, because they're worried that, the Uber driver won't take us home. Or, things, there's always there, and, oh, be careful, don't walk home by yourself, be careful, and they're just looking out for us. And, it is smart to pay attention to what locals say about how careful to be.
Well, this leads interestingly into the last question. How would you measure the impact of spending years abroad in non-Western environments in terms of reflecting on your view of the world beforehand? What sort of perspective has it given you on the prevailing dominant culture in countries like Australia and our understanding of cultures other than our own?
Right, heavy.
That's a good one.
Like I was saying, like we're here and we are learning more and more every day, but we still have an identity of being from our respective countries. And after having gone back to the USA and then, back to Australia, back to the USA, now Vietnam, back here, there, you do get an interesting lens of your own culture. You still see it in yourself, and I think that it keeps changing because, you have a resentment and then you kind of say, well, no, there are good parts that I like as well. So I don't know, you're just always learning about yourself in the context of where you are, and I don't know, you kind of just lower all of your assumptions about your world.
I remember moving to Australia when I was 12, and I was told when I was growing up, you are Australian, you are Australian. My parents were Australian. I didn't know Australia. I visited once in my childhood, and I spent my whole childhood in Papua New Guinea and then moved when I was 12 to Australia. And I found it a completely foreign country. And one thing that really frustrated me was the attitude that people had in Australia at the time towards New Guinea. And they treated it as if it was this barbarous place full of, murderers and rapists. It sounds a bit like what I was hearing in the USA about Mexico.
I mean, the president himself has words to say about it.
Yeah. And I found that really frustrating. And then after spending a long time living in Australia, I got very used to living there, and I kind of was more understanding of the worldview that Australians have. But the thing I think in particular that Australia suffers from is by default, the rest of the world, for most lifelong residents of Australia, is a holiday destination. rather than alternative societies, alternative worlds that have been built
Oh,
up.
it's definitely true of the US as well.
Yeah, well,
I mean, it's a bubble.
I take your word for
Yeah.
it. So I'm reminded, living outside of Australia again, of how many people live with different conceptions of how to order their lives, different sets of values about what matters and what doesn't. And however entangled we are in global capitalism and all the problems that we face, climate change and everything else, the day-to-day living that most people experience, I think, while there are an enormous number of similarities and basic values, there are distinct differences.
Yeah.
And
there's still differences, you know.
Definitely.
Like,
definitely.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I really am grateful for is that being in this position has forced us to, well, I'll say us, I'm speaking for me, but I'm assuming it's the same for you, has forced us to, I don't know, recognize that the places that we've come from are just somewhere in the world. You know, they're not everywhere, and they certainly don't contain
the best way.
The best way.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things that are done well in other places, and some things that are done worse, and that changes from place to place, city to city, town to town.
Definitely. I mean, in the USA, people really feel sorry for other countries. I mean, that's something that is. That's something I hear in my friends and my family, and it's sort of like, oh, why would you choose to leave? And it's silly, you know, it's silly because there are many different ways to live,
sure.
And there are many things in Mexico that are much better than in the States. Healthcare for one, you know.
God, yes.
Yeah, you know, like that's a huge one. So it's just it is funny to just live it and sort of prove to everybody else that it's doable, and you know, you're seeing the evidence before you of people who are living really good lives.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there aren't things. I mean, you wouldn't want the reverse to suddenly be true, where you're just
that's what I was
slavishly worshipping foreign countries as being somehow superior to yours.
Yeah, that is a good part.
Well, for one thing, we've talked a lot about how luxurious it is to have sidewalks, pavements, footpaths, whichever word you want to use, that are uncluttered, where you could walk along and not actually have to spend the whole time looking at your feet. That has taken on a kind of
also running
majesty.
Water that you can drink, like from the faucet. That's
right.
a good one.
But I mean, these are
you can deal with it. Yeah, you can deal with. Oh, that's what I was going to say. You can deal with anything. That's something that surprises me, is that, you know, when you're in a place that's easier, where you have running water that's clean and sidewalks, you kind of think, oh, why would I go somewhere where it's a bit more difficult? But people are quite resilient, and when we travel, we prove to ourselves that we're very resilient, whether it's dealing with culture shock or practical things. You know, you can cope with anything, and that's quite empowering.
Yeah. I think the last thing I was going to say, I just looked back at the question just to remind me.
We got off topic.
But the last thing I was going to say is that I know there is a temptation also to be very critical about the dominant culture in one's home country. Goodness knows there's a lot about Australia that, you know, really, you know, I'm sure all of us share frustrations about. But the thing I'm reminded about living here and having been living in Vietnam recently is that virtually all of us take an awful lot for granted most of the time. And even when we think we're being critical and we think that we're attaining this perspective and really able to analyze something critically, we're still missing things. And there is more to be said for kindness and for people extending friendship and the chance for the space for people to make mistakes and to learn, and for it not to be a fatal error or to throw you outside of human community. maybe this is just me getting old and sentimental, I don't know. But it's tempting to be critical about Australia, but I think that while there is a lot about the dominant attitude in Australia, which I feel is in need of correction, I also recognise the fact that a lot of it's simply born out of the situation that people find themselves living in down there. So it's no surprise, you know. We are creatures of our environment. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I think seeing your own country from the lens of far away is interesting, and you do see just kind of that sort of basic truth, I guess. Nice.
All right,
we're done. We need to not.
Yeah, I think that's
talk anymore.
Fine. They'll carve this up.
Yeah, maybe. Bye, Ben.
Whatever they like.
Good luck.